Thank you, everyone. Does it sound loud enough?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I think there's a few people come from quite a few miles away, so thanks very much to those people tonight. I'm going to talk about this guy, sort of going forwards and backwards to the computer occasionally to see if it works.
Possibly one of the most interesting aspects of the study of flying saucers, beyond the realization that they are real and extraterrestrial, is their philosophy. What manner of creatures build and fly them? What do they look like? How do they think? Are their ideas and ideals similar to ours? Could we understand them? All these and many other questions plague the serious investigator.
So in this presentation we will mainly examine Wilbert Smith's key role in the research and analysis of the flying saucer phenomenon. Smith seems to have significant things to tell us. He does not seem to be that well known. As a prominent member of the Canadian government, he had access to classified information. Smith held an unusual combination of views which seemed to be at odds with his scientific background and other work. We will come across other figures who either worked with Smith, gave him information, or were speaking out during the same time period. We will also look at some other issues pertaining to the UFO and ET disclosure. What some of the astronauts have said, for example. That's really the second half of this presentation, which I've added to since I gave it at Leeds earlier this year. We're going to look at some documents from the McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Corporation, which were linked to us in 2005. I've also made a short video of Travis Walton's incredible case, which is documented in the police record, with multiple witnesses to many of the events. And also we're going to look at some incredibly inexplicable footage from Mexico, which was taken this year. It's just an addition to the end of this. So it's kind of like going from the start of what might be called the modern disclosure process up to some more recent developments. And I've seen a lot of parallels with what's going on in the UFO disclosure movement to what's happening with the 9/11 truth movement. Very similar things going on, which I'll try and illustrate in this talk. So Wilbert Smith, what he did is he checked the evidence. His conventional life is this. He was born in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada in 1910. He graduated from the University of British Columbia in 1933 with a bachelor's in electrical engineering. He obtained a master's degree in 1934, also at the University of British Columbia. In 1934-5, he became chief engineer for the radio station CJOR in Vancouver. In the years following, at certain times, he acted as a consultant to the government, because of his expertise in radio technology at the time. And in 1939, he joined the Federal Department of Transport of the Canadian government. He was engaged in the engineering of Canada's wartime radio monitoring service. That was the system whereby, when Canada wanted to collect its intelligence reports from the field, they would come through the radio network, and Smith was involved in the engineering of that network. In 1947, he was in charge of establishing a network of ionospheric measurement stations, several of which were in isolated parts of northern Canada. That the ionosphere is the charged region of the atmosphere which interacts with the solar wind, and you can actually bounce radio signals off it. This is how shortwave radio works. You bounce shortwave radio signals off the ionosphere. So the ionospheric measurement stations were to do with being able to propagate radio waves over long distances. He eventually became Superintendent of Radio Regulations and Engineering with the Department of Transport in Canada, DOT. His research was in radio wave propagation, in other words, how radio waves travel through the atmosphere, where he came across such topics as auroras, cosmic radiation, atmospheric radioactivity, and geomagnetism. That's to do with the Earth's magnetic field, which tied in with theories on aspects of the saucer phenomenon. He continued to work for the Department of Transport until his death in 1962. And he died of cancer of the lower bowel, not cancer of the brain, as some people have tried to say. And at the time of his death, he held 37 patents. This is an intelligent guy. He was married to Merle, and they had 3 children, James, Dick, and Norma Ray. I'm going to hear a lot of audio of his son, which was from about 2002, 2003, towards the end of this part of the presentation. Now, his interest in flying saucers started when he became curious after reading a magazine article in the late 1940s, possibly the early 50s. Though he started out as a strong skeptic, he pursued this interest in his own time strongly and systematically. He took a scientific approach to evaluating the evidence. He almost always referred to them as flying saucers, and very rarely as UFOs, because that was a term that was actually coined by Edward J. Ruppelt in 1952. In other words, that's what you might call a psychological operation. If you call it a UFO, it puts it into a state of uncertainty already, so it's unidentified. And under certain conditions you can identify them, that they don't belong to any of our conventional technology. Now, some of Smith's contemporaries that some people you might have heard of who are perhaps more well known are, for example, George Adamski, the famous case that he met these people from Venus. And some people just think he was a nutter, but if you actually listen to some of his early sort of statements, they are a bit more interesting. Over time, he seemed to elaborate on things, but you certainly can't dismiss his stories out of hand. Frank Edwards was a bit like a sort of George Newry of his time, one of these sort of investigative reporters. Major Donald Kehoe was at one time in the Air Force, I believe, either Army or Air Force, I can't remember which, but he was outspoken about the UFO cover-up in the 50s. And Kenneth Arnold, who's of course started what's commonly referred to as the modern UFO era with his sighting in 1947 when he was flying his plane somewhere near Mount Rainier. And there is a link from Smith to these two people, Betty and Barney Hill, who was the first alien abduction case which was well documented in 1961. But if people have heard Wilbert Smith's name, how many people have heard of Wilbert Smith? Okay, yeah, one or two people. It's not the horror, it's not the thriller author Wilbert Smith. This is Wilbert Smith, of course. If you have heard of him, it's probably in connection to this. Now, this is one of those documents. I mean, we've had all this wonderful these disclosures recently, from all these French government and MOD have released 1,000-page document, and it makes me laugh. I mean, I'll refer to this again later, but this memo. We've got two different copies of this memo, a draft copy which was in Smith's own files, and then one which I think was actually in the official government archive and was released under the Freedom of Information Act in 1979, I think. But this memo, which I'm going to mention, it was written by Smith in November 1950, and researcher Nick Velasquez discovered a copy in the University of Ottawa archives. And it was declassified by the Canadian government in 1979, and this is what somebody says. I'll read out the bullet points. Talking of the UFO matter, it says this: the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rated higher even than the H-bomb. That flying saucers exist, and their modus operandi, that's their way of working, is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. So we've got names. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. This was the top secret memo that Smith had written to the people in the Canadian government after he'd had contact with people in the American government as part of his work. I was further informed that the United States authorities are investigating on quite a number of lines which might possibly be related to the sources, such as mental phenomena. And I gather they are not doing too well, since they indicated that if Canada is doing anything at all in geomagnetics, they would welcome a discussion with suitably accredited Canadians. So already Smith is talking about the mental phenomena associated with flying saucers. This is a very advanced area of sort of study for the time. Now, the information in this memo about classification by the US government came from somebody else. And if the people that have researched into this, like Stanton Friedman and Grant Cameron, say that it came from a chap called Dr. Robert Sarbacher, and he actually confirmed this in 1983 in a telephone interview with nuclear physicist and UFO investigator Stanton Friedman. So how do we confirm that that's what happened? Well, we have an audio of that telephone conversation.
Hello? Dr. Sarbacher? Yes, sir. Hi, Stan Friedman up in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. Oh, for heaven's sake. Let's see, early 50s. Now, the notes that I sent you from Wilbert Smith, you do remember talking to him?
Yeah, vaguely.
The Canadian?
Yeah, vaguely.
Okay, his notes were 1950, and let me see the exact date. September 15th were his notes, 1950. He asked you a question that you didn't answer at that time, which was rather fascinating. Maybe you've just given me the answer in a sense. He quotes you as saying, yes, it is classified 2 points higher even than the H-bomb. In fact, the most highly classified subject in U.S. government at the present time. And
that was his latest idea. Why?
Well,
it seems silly to me.
Well, his next comment, that was supposedly what you said, and then his next comment was, may I ask the reason for the classification? And you said, you may ask, but I can't tell you. Do you think that?
Because I didn't know.
Oh, okay, not because of this crash. You see, there's no mention of a crash per se in this note. Do you think it could have happened after this?
I don't know. There may have been several of them. There was some talk that there were.
Huh?
So there you hear that Sarbacher did give him that information, and he talked about the rumour of UFO crashes, which of course comes up again and again. And it's precisely this sort of information which is left out of these supposedly official disclosures we've been seeing in the last couple of years. Now, it's not clear who gave Smith the information about the mental phenomenon, but it wasn't Sarbacher. In other words, that the US were investigating how these sources were controlled under, by sometimes mind control. Smith left the memo draft in the files to give future researchers the truth of what had actually happened in the early days of government investigation into flying saucers. Dying of cancer, Smith made arrangements with his wife to hide the files so that it would survive his death. They would be coming to recover them, he told his wife Merle. As Smith predicted, Canadians, Americans and Soviets approached Mrs. Smith requesting the files for research purposes. And Mrs. Smith told all callers she no longer had the files. After a number of break-ins that might have been linked to the search for the files were passed on to Arthur Bray, and also a researcher who held them quietly for over 20 years. And I've got a CD over there with about 1,000 pages of Smith-related material on it and some audios, which have been preserved initially by Arthur Bray and then Grant Cameron, who basically put all the Smith information together, and I've summarised it. So I have got some CDs, you can get them from me through the website, but it's in a raw format, it's just like a set of files, it hasn't got a DVD associated with it or anything like that, just this, which is what I've put together. Now, what Smith ended up doing was he became so interested in the flying saucer phenomenon, and he investigated for such a long time, that he decided to try and set up a government project, which he headed up, and it was called Project Magnet. And he asked for some assistance from the government. And this was part of the memo, this is why he wrote to the government, because he basically says, well, the US are doing this investigation, we should be investigating this too. And he said, it is therefore recommended that a project be set up within the framework of this section, in other words, a section where he worked, the Department of Transport and his particular team, to study this problem, and that the work be carried on a part-time basis until such time as sufficient tangible results can be seen to warrant a more definitive action. The cost of the programme in its initial stages is expected to be less than a few $100s and can be carried out by a radio standards lab appropriation. So in other words, officially Smith's flying saucer interest was private, right? In reality, he used his knowledge and government position to instigate a research project known as Project Magnet. And that's shown in the memo, to study aspects of the phenomenon. So he's basically saying, look, I want to use some government resources to investigate this, with my team. That's really all I'm doing. I'm not going to do anything else. He's talking about a few $100s, so maybe to just borrow or buy a couple of small bits of equipment to do further research. Now, Smith was therefore proposing to set up a semi-official study of the source of phenomenon, and the proposal was accepted, and a station was set up at Shirley Bay, about 20 miles outside Ottawa. This was the Department of Transport's communications monitoring facility, so he already had some equipment there. The area was later to be used by the Department of Defence. And so we have some pictures from Project Magnet, and you can see it's basically radio equipment and other equipment to do with geomagnetics, which was what he was using to, basically what they ended up doing was building the UFO monitoring station. That's what he did, and you'll hear about that in it shortly. So here we have pictures of some of their facilities at Shirley Bay. The project ran for about 3 or 4 years with the aim of gathering information about magnetic phenomena. It was meant to be classified in case the results were yielded a new insight into magnetic phenomena which might be exploited. And it was not actually called at the source of detection station, and its existence was only reluctantly acknowledged during Smith's lifetime. In other words, they didn't really want to have anything to do with this, but because Smith was quite influential, he was able to get it past them. Now, what actually happened was on August the 8th, 1954, at 3:01 p.m, after 8 months of watching flat lines on graph paper, the gravimeter, which was measuring the Earth's gravitational field, began to twitch and then it went crazy. Unfortunately, the area was completely fogged in, and the observatory of Project Magnet was shut down on August the 10th, 1954, only 2 days later. After Smith's death in 1962, the strength of denials about the project seemed to increase, which we'll hear about in a minute. But let's first have a little clip of Wilbert Smith telling us about Project Magnet.
I might point out that the Project Magnet that I was associated with, and which received a great deal of publicity, was not an official government project. It was a project that I talked the Deputy Minister into letting me carry out, making use of the extensive field organization of the Department of Transport. No funds were spent on it, and we merely had access to the very large field organization and opened a number of files. Unfortunately, the gentleman of the press climbed on this and made a big deal out of it. As a matter of fact, some of the headlines concerning Project Magnet were set in larger type than the declaration of war. However, we carried the project through officially for about 4 years, and the last year of the 4, we had a little shed set up in which we had a number of instruments, the idea being to try and coordinate sightings with scientific measurements. We had equipment for detecting any radio noise that might emanate from these objects, any gravitational disturbances which might result, any radioactivity which might be connected with it, and any magnetic disturbances. These 4 instruments were of a recording type and produced graphical lines on a recording tape using a 4-pin recorder. This ran 24 hours a day with alarm circuits attached so that in case any of the pins moved beyond a prescribed limit, the horns would blow and the bells would ring, and the boys in the nearby ionosphere station were supposed to come running to see if they could see anything.
So basically what he was saying there was they wanted to see if they could make measurements whilst somebody was sighting a UFO, flying saucer. They could measure it with measure the magnetic field and so forth. That's what his goal was. So again, he was trying to take a scientific approach. Now, Project Magnet interim report, I don't think I'll read all this out, but basically it was classified in 1953, and it was not declassified until 1979. Okay? And Smith determined that there was a 91% probability that the objects are real, and a 60% probability that they are alien vehicles. He wasn't afraid of saying that. He wasn't afraid of saying that at all. And then Smith commented that somebody had written to him and they wanted to get this report declassified, and he basically says he's no chance, they're not going to declassify it. And he says any report which in any way might prove embarrassing or give rise to questions which he or his colleagues might find difficult to answer is not going to get declassified. Now, Project Magnet denials are quite interesting to read about when you read through this sort of information. A statement prepared for the Minister of Transport to be presented in the House of Commons in Canada in the 1950s, for example, said, "This entire programme, i.e. Project Magnet, being carried on with official approval and authority to make use of existing facilities." That was what they said in 1950. Months after Smith died in late 1962, Mr. Dupuy, Minister of the Department of Transport, made his final positive statement in the House of Commons. Between December of 1950 and August 1954, a small program investigation in the field of geomagnetics was carried out by the then Communications Division of the Department of Transport with a view to obtaining, if possible, some physical information or facts which might help to explain the phenomena which was generally referred to as unidentified flying objects. Mr. W.B. Smith was the engineer in charge of this program. But by 1964, Arthur Bray received a letter that started the denial. At no time has this department carried out research in the field of unidentified flying objects. The department did not take part in any of Smith's research work, nor did Mr. Smith provide the department with any useful information arising out of this work. By 1968, the denial was completed. The statement would be forever provided for inquiries related to Smith was completed. The key UFO skeptic at the Dominion Observatory, Dr. Peter Milner, wrote it up. The project was a personal one carried out by Mr. Smith with the knowledge of his department, but without any official sponsorship. Complete reversal of what was true, which is what you get, obviously, with all this sort of stuff. Now, where the Smith case gets really interesting is when he actually started getting contacts. And unusually, for some contactee cases, certainly this type, he actually got in contact with two named boys from the top side, as they were called Atta and Tyler. Now, he came into contact with somebody called Francis Swan, who was, medium or a psychic. Which you might want to write this all off because of that. That's fine. It's up to you. There are some very interesting bits of information in amongst some of the strange stuff here. Now, what Smith did was he went round and he interviewed people who had sightings and interviewed people who claimed to be in contact with extraterrestrials. Okay, so. But Swan had also come into contact with the US government. Okay, and we're going to hear a bit more about this because she'd come into the contact with the US government regarding two mysterious satellites which orbited the Earth in 1953 and 1954. One of which reportedly came in and hovered over the Pentagon at 90,000 feet. Now, of course, anyone know when Sputnik went up? You know what year that was?
57.
57. So this is 4 years before Sputnik. So this can't be anything we have. The Navy knew about these satellites. This is a story that hardly anybody has heard about. But thanks to Grant Cameron, I found out about this. Swan claimed to be in contact with one of the occupants of the ship, and he was named Atta, who was commander of M4, and Ponar was the commander of L11. Possibly she described them as 190 miles across, these huge satellites. Now, Vice Admiral Knowles, he knew Smith, and he lived close to Swan, and he asked her technical questions which she was able to answer. And this convinced Knowles that she had genuine knowledge. Swan was later investigated by the FBI. So why would the FBI bother with investigating the psychic? Why would they waste their time? Swan stated on many occasions that she was in contact with Atta, and these contacts went on for several years. She tried to arrange a meeting between Atta, Smith, government officials at an agreed location. And yes, the documents about this were originally classified. And coincidentally, Francis Swan lived quite close to Betty and Barney Hill in Elliot. They lived about a mile away. Betty and Barney Hill came to fame in 1961. Now, this is some of the transcribed sort of notes about the contact sessions that Francis Swan had. I'm not going to read it all out, but it's quite interesting to read some of these. I mean, again, what I found in reading the bits that I've read of this, which is not very much, it's a mixture of really good and bad information. I mean, there's one bit where it says, the Earth's going to be blown up in 1956 or something, and we know that didn't happen. So you do tend to get a mixture of stuff, but some of it, as you'll see later on, becomes more concrete. Let's see. And basically, she's just reading what Atta is telling her, and she says, M4, yes, good. M4, we hear you, all is well, Atta. We are all right, do not worry, contact is good, lots of love for your attention. And this is pages and pages of this stuff, if you want. It's all on that CD if you want to go and read it. Incredible. But going on to the satellites, this is a really interesting story.
Our guest tonight is Major Donald E. Kehoe, U.S. Marine Corps retired, a veteran of 35 years of civilian and military flying experience. Major Kehoe was aide to Colonel Charles Lindbergh on Lindy's tour of the country after the historic transatlantic flight. A well-known aviation writer, in 1950, Major Kehoe brought out his bestseller, Flying Saucers Are Real, which stirred up a real tempest. And in 1953, another bestseller, Flying Saucers from Outer Space, books based on material from Air Force and Canadian official sources. Major Kehoe, what are the most recent developments in this field of unidentified flying objects?
There are three very important developments which have been kept from the public. In the first place, there is at least one, and possibly two, artificial satellites circling the Earth at the present time. An intensive effort is being made by government scientists at White Sands, New Mexico, to locate and chart the courses of these satellites in an effort to determine what they are and where they came from. Secondly, within the last 2 weeks, Canadian government scientists have notified all official skywatchers to be especially alert and to report immediately any unidentified aerial object. The third development, which has been kept secret, is this. In the closing week of March, Air Force Secretary Talbot made 2 trips to Palm Springs, California in an Air Force plane. On one of those trips, shortly after the plane had passed Fresno, California, the crew of Secretary Talbot's plane discovered that it was being followed by a large, silvery, disc-shaped object, which was flying about 1,000 feet below the Secretary's plane and about 1,000 feet distant. The unidentified object was seen by Secretary Talbot, the crew of his plane, and Secretary Talbot's aides who accompanied him on the trip. After watching the disc for several minutes, Secretary Talbot ordered his plane to swing around and approach it. The object immediately accelerated and disappeared at high speed. This was a daylight sighting of long duration by credible personnel and under very favorable conditions. In view of the tremendous amount of evidence that is being concealed by Air Force secrecy, it is high time the American people demanded to know the facts.
So that was basically an audio of Kehoe. You know, it's a bit ropey and stuff, but it is, as you appreciate, from 1954, which is 55 years ago. So, you know, we are going back in history quite a long way. But Kehoe confirmed this story. You can see it was in the papers. So, you know, what else can I tell you?
It's in the paper, it must be true.
Well, yeah. But the Navy did actually track them on radar. So, there you go. Another contact, they had another contact who used to send Wilbert Smith information, and he was actually a blind telex operator living in Ottawa. In 1955, and we're going to come on to this, during one of Smith's gravity control experiments in his lab, which we're going to come to in a minute, they were rotating a copper plate at 15,000 to 18,000 revs per minute. The phone rang and the telex operator reported he had had a message from AFA saying the experiment needed shielding. They built a brick wall around the experiment. The experiment did indeed blow up on the next run. So this is one of these strange stories. There's another story I haven't put in here where they actually tried to get AFA to come and show this ship to some of the either Navy or Army officials at a certain location. And apparently this ship did actually show up on time. That was also in the 50s. I haven't got full details of that in here because I didn't have time to put it in. Now, Smith also stated that he has contact through an anonymous intermediary with another man from outside, who he called them people from outside. He didn't call them aliens, he didn't call them ETs, he called them either the boys topside or people from outside. And you can hear it telling you the story here. Again, it's all recorded, so you just have to struggle with that.
But he has had contact with one of these people from outside now for a period of 4 years that I know of, and I believe that this contact has preceded that by several years. This contact's name, the man here on Earth, I cannot quote, but the man from outside, his name is Tyler, and he calls himself a garbage collector. His big job, he says, is to go around after we have misbehaved and clean up the mess. By misbehaving, I mean setting off nuclear explosions. Now, he gathers up this material, does something to it on board the craft, what we don't know, but it renders it reasonably inert. And then once a year, or thereabouts, it takes about a year to process this material, he dumps it in some rather secluded spot. In I think it was 1947, a November issue or December issue of Time magazine had a picture of Tyler's craft dumping this material out over the American desert. A year later, Tyler sent a message through my friend, that he was going to dump some again, that he would this time pick an opportune time when many people could witness the process, and that he would dump it somewhere near Ottawa. So shortly after the armistice celebrations down at Confucian Square in Ottawa, everyone was buzzing around town. It was a very pleasant day. We looked up to the northwest of Ottawa, and there was Tyler's little craft, a lake-shaped affair, up in the sky, and coming out of the tail end of this was what looked like a almost dissipated portion of a jet trail, and this was dropping down. It was a white, smoky-looking affair that was dropping down from the rear of this little craft, which was set at about an angle of 30 to 45 degrees. Well, we watched this through binoculars. In fact, having been warned, we had these things handy. We stood out in the yard, and I think about half of Ottawa was out watching it too. And the dump took about 20 minutes. We stood there and watched it, and this tail of dust kept getting lower and lower, and finally, when we looked up again, Tyler's craft was gone. We didn't see him go. Maybe he just took off in a hurry when he figured the job was done. Anyway, we watched this dust until it had dissipated almost to the point where we couldn't really see it anymore, but by that time it was down pretty close to the horizon. Now, knowing the size of Tyler's craft, which is roughly 1,000 feet long, we calculated from the field of the binoculars, other data, that he was about 50 miles away from Ottawa and about somewhere around 15 to 20 miles high, and just to the northwest of the city of Ottawa. Well, looking on the map, that region is completely and entirely uninhabited.
So that was the story of Tyler, or part of the story of Tyler. Now, when I spoke to Grant Cameron about his experiences with Wilbert Smith material, Grant actually got to know Wilbert Smith's wife and his son quite well. And he said that the way that they used to talk about Affa and Tyler was that they were like members of the family to him. You know, he'd say, Affa said this today, Affa said that today. You know, it's like really just totally weird how he described it. Now, also what Smith got involved with is he said that these people were giving him information. And this is, I think, probably the most convincing thing to me, that he really was in touch with external intelligences. As part of Project Magnet, Smith conducted some experiments in which he showed it was possible to extract energy from the Earth's magnetic field. He thought this is what sources use for both propulsion and as an energy source. He described this device as a magnetic sink into which energy would flow. And this is the circuit he designed, and this sort of stuff is all on the CD. And I showed this at another presentation a few years ago, and there's a guy in the audience who says, yeah, I can understand what that circuit does. I understand little bits of it, but I'm certainly not an electronics expert. So